This video highlights the East Coast version of the American Medical Response, or AMR Whelen Edge light bar. If you're looking for footage of the bar itself, I do have a shorter video that doesn't have history. In order to learn about this bar, we got to go back to the early 1990s. AMR was buying up or bought up a smaller group of West Coast ambulance companies. The West Coast had their own setup and light bar, which is not this. This is the light bar that the East Coast units adopted for the most part. And as you can see, it's a very unique combination of directional strobes and directional halogen lights. It's not your standard ambulance light bar. When I set about building this 9000 version, this is the schematic or the layout of how it turns out. You end up with 3 forward-facing halogen lights, which are wired to the ambulance's flasher. They are not on their own flasher. They mirror or theoretically could replace the federal ambulance K required primary secondary lights. And they were always wired such that they would be connected to that flasher. There was a 9M version later, near the end of the run of putting light bars on van ambulances. It often sat atop vehicle with early generation LED primary lights. But again, it still had that same setup of the center white and the end red flashing halogen, what you would call primary lights. If you're unclear as to what primary lights are, those are the larger box lights. They sit, in this case, underneath the light bar. That's an example of what the front would look like. But to really explore it, we need to look at the federal ambulance specifications, which unfortunately got the letters K, K, and K. And they're very specific about the flasher placement and sequence of warning lights on ambulances. And much like NFPA, it is not followed everywhere. It is a federal guideline. And in places where it's adopted, sometimes it is the only lighting on a vehicle. Especially on federal government vehicles, you would see this minimum as the only lights. And you could argue whether or not that's sufficient. Initially incandescent or halogen, later you continued to see them in LED and strobe. I have a whole nother video about how it was accomplished in strobe format. And it is your red corner box lights, your center clear, your rear center amber, and then your cab/grill lights, and the sequence in which they flash. The red box lights have to flash together against the center clear and amber, and the cab lights. And then in secondary mode, you got to turn off the clear and the cab lights. So it was adopted by a lot of federal agencies as their lighting. However, there are some larger cities that saw this as not just a minimum, but a setup. Chicago was one of them. They kept their ambulances this way for quite a long time, and didn't even abandon it till after they had started using LEDs. Washington, D.C. was another example. They only recently abandoned the minimum. So if we're going to talk about K ambulance primary secondary flashers, we can go through the ones here, and I'll use them to illuminate my rig, which the lower amber would be on the rear. The clear would be on the front. You're going to have to put that in your imagination. There's obviously 6 other box lights and 4 cab lights that aren't pictured here, but the primary difference between the modes of a federal ambulance compliant flasher system is the removal of the white and the leaving of the amber illuminated and in a secondary mode. That's pretty much your mode 1, mode 2, primary, secondary, however you wanted to call it. But this rig that I set up here shows you kind of the difference between the modes. And I'm going to be using the front portion of it to contrast against the AMR edges after a short showcase of the actual light bar itself. So that's kind of a brief history on federal ambulance specs and how they play into this light bar. So if it's theoretically optional, why did AMR, which was becoming a large multinational national company, care about following this standard? Well, ambulance regulations, especially for private ambulance companies, fall into a variety of categories. They are going to be regulated by their state, most likely, perhaps local governments, but moreover, they're going to be regulated by contract usually. And sometimes contract will specify that they have to be federally compliant. So this light bar, which provided the primary lights in the bar, was a very flexible option. When I built this one out, I did build it to spec, and you can see you have your federal compliant upper flash pattern with the remaining space filled with strobe lights. The fact that this job could theoretically be accomplished by other lights, and different light bars were often used by other companies, and the federal primary secondary lights were separate lights, is kind of what makes these bars special. There's speculation about why AMR decided to build a bar that included the primary secondary lights into the setup. I think it really just comes down to a wider range of compliance using one light bar. You can see there are some alley position lights here flashing. In the 9000 version, they were usually tied to the ambulance flasher. Sometimes they were grouped on the primary side with the white light. Sometimes they were grouped on the secondary side with the red corner lights. Other times they were grouped with the amber rear lamp, which would flash with the primary but wouldn't be turned off with the center white. So theoretically, that means those side lights would alternate against your corner lights and wouldn't go out when you turn the truck into secondary mode. That was one way they were set up. But it gave a lot of flexibility because the flashing was all external with these light bars. So we can run through the modes of the light bar that I built, which was the earlier 9000 East Coast version. Put it into secondary mode. You can see that the side alley light position red lights are flashing as if they were the amber in this case. That's not always how it was set up. That's how I did it. That also meant that you could do a kind of a white cutoff, which you could flash the red corner lights, turn on just the red strobes, and you had those side flashing alleys as well. Not all places did this. And then in primary mode, you added your white center, and usually or oftentimes the full use of the strobes was then tied to primary mode, if you will. If there was a separate switch for, quote, light bar, it would control usually just the strobes. So this would be full on mode, whether it's considered to be primary mode or whether it's considered to be primary plus light bar is going to vary based on your setup. There were places that used this light bar that would consider secondary mode to be red flashers and primary mode to be every single light turned on and you had just one switch. There were other places where that separated. As you can see here by the strobe pattern, the whites and the reds in this version are on separate switches, so you could theoretically turn red and white on separately. So let's compare that light bar to how it would be found in the wild, and kind of shows the sequence there. But in the wild, it would be right on top of these 9x7 sized primary flashers. So in secondary mode, you have the end lights of the light bar flashing not in sequence, actually simultaneously, with the larger lamps right under them. In this case, I chose not to turn on that alley light, and then with the alley light on, that's what it looks like. Again, an option. But either way, to the front, you have your end red lamps flashing exactly with the much larger primary lights beneath them. In primary mode, same deal. Your center white flasher is flashing right along in sequence with the twin, if you will, of the other size. So you're really just duplicating functions. You're placing the federal required primary secondary lamps into the light bar and then placing it on top of the external version. And here's that white cutoff option that you could have theoretically, where you turn off the primary mode and continue to use your red strobes. That was not very common. I just thought it was interesting, and it also wasn't an option on the 9M, so that's why I included it. And with the whole light bar illuminated, the only thing that is not duplicated is going to be your strobes. So you have a total of 6 halogen lamps to the front, and they're grouped where your center ones are flashing together and your side ones are flashing together, and they're not very far away from each other on a van ambulance. Dependent upon what the primary lights were, a lot of times it really wasn't very easy to distinguish that there even were separate lamps in the light bar. It was really a duplication of workload, if you will, and that's why there's some speculation around these bars and why they're interesting bars, because really they could have been used without those lower 9x7 flashing primary lights. Those are included in the light bar. When you are a large corporation that uses a lot of different types of vehicles, it's probably advantageous to not have to have those flashers on the front of the vehicle independent from the light bar. And even though the van ambulances that did not have those lamps were primarily on the West Coast where this system was not used, they did kind of trickle their way into the central region where these types of flashers should have been used. And in that case, you now have solved the problem of not having those larger flashers on the front of your ambulance box because they're included right in your light bar. So that's kind of the long and the short of the 9000 version. It actually continued, this light bar continued into the 9M era, and it really didn't change a lot. Your primary differences are going to be that instead of using dual twin side beam halogen flashers, you used actual 7x3 or 700 series halogen flashers in the light bar. So now you were even more closely mirroring the lights that they were directly over. If they sat close to one another on a van, which they often did, they really tended to blend together, especially since this light bar was a little bit longer generally. Also, in general, these light bars, the strobes were on or off together. There was no switching. And the side flasher in the alley light position did not come on in secondary mode and was not controlled by the ambulance flasher. In primary mode, the center white illuminates, of course, on both the exterior and interior. But now you also do get that end alley position flasher, and it was on its own internal edge light bar flasher. It did not synchronize with any part of the ambulance flasher at all, but it was generally switched with the primary mode. So when your bar was placed in primary mode, you also got that extra flasher. That is not 100% of the time a rule. However, that's generally how you saw these. There were exceptions. Sometimes it did come on in secondary, and I have seen it where it's switched, I believe, with the actual strobe portion. But to get that extra end flasher, you ended up with a non-synchronous interior flasher, and it was not tied to the ambulance flasher. And again, you were pretty much all or nothing on the strobe front. You got your 4 strobes, which were 400 series linears. They came on as a group of 4. Because they flash in the center out pattern or out in, not left right, you're not making a pair of reds and a pair of whites. You're making them such that you're flashing red against white, and on the power supply type of this light bar, independently switching them under that configuration is not really an option. So you couldn't just simultaneously flash the reds and not turn on the whites. So the answer to that is that you're going to be flashing both the reds and the whites when you illuminate the strobes. Again, sometimes primary turned on everything, and secondary shut you down to your red corner flashers, and sometimes primary had an additional switch called Lightbar, which just turned on the strobes. That would be operationally dependent on where you were and what it was being used for, but this 9M version of the bar was very similar to the 9000 version. Not identical, but extremely similar in a lot of respects. So we can get into some speculation as to why these actually existed. AMR is no stranger to conforming to their local contracts and utilizing setups on ambulances that are nothing like this. And AMR did and will conform to local standards. However, they would like to keep things as normal as possible. So why didn't they just throw your standard light bar on top of their vans? Standard light bars did exist for vans, and they still do. I believe your main reason is that you could theoretically use this on a van that did not have any primary lights to the front. This sort of light bar, which is just basic strobes and maybe a center option, you would see those a lot of times on van ambulances. For other companies, they were usually switched as a whole with a light bar switch, and the primary secondary lights were separate. This is blue and white. It would probably be red and white in an ambulance scenario, but again, another basic light bar that would have been an option for van ambulances that AMR chose not to go with. They chose to build out their own bar that was more versatile in the sense that it contained other things. So in the West, you did not have those primary secondary lights underneath the light bar. Leader Coach built these ambulances, and the West ambulances actually did not comply with federal triple K. They had their own setup that accommodated steady burn lights, and you would see the red steady burn California lights trickle over into other West Coast markets. So this van working its way to the East Coast is one possible reason or theory for putting your primary secondary lights in a light bar, because if it was required, you would have them. However, there's another factor or theory. You can see the generic box next to the the van there, and look what the generic box has. It has a light bar that also contains everything: primary, secondary lights, and warning. And AMR, when they were required to have mods, used this bar a lot. It's the Advantage Plus or the 4500. It acted just like the AMR Edge did. Primary, secondary lights, and 4 warning lights. They were usually halogen, not strobe, but even if you did it as an Edge Plus, which was very similar, you're getting the same thing as the quote AMR Edge. You're getting an all-in-one package, and there's no need to put lights underneath it. And that continues to this day. So, was the AMR Edge also a product of the idea that you can throw everything in one light bar and not have to worry about putting primary lights underneath it? Yes. Was it a product of the fact that they were doing this in their modular trucks? Probably. Was it necessary to do in the vans that had the lights separately duplicated underneath? No. But did it hurt anything? Not really. And it allowed standardization so that a light bar could be used across multiple platforms, including a platform that did not have your primary, secondary lights underneath the bar on the van. And it does kind of mirror what they would put on their box ambulances, which in this case it has the oscillating lights for warning, but they would often be rotating. But the important thing is you've got those 7x3 sized federal primary lights in the light bar with no need to find another place to put them. And on a van, that's pretty important. So now light bars on vans are pretty much gone. You're seeing LEDs surface mounted, and you're still seeing that side alley position looking light though, which is interesting. I guess to kind of speak to the side warning issue. But the days of the AMR Edge are over because the days of the light bar on the van ambulance are over. So in a nutshell, that's the AMR Edge. I hope you enjoyed this look at the American Medical Response East Coast Whelen Edge versions. I will release another version of just light bar footage, and I'd like to look at the West Coast version at some point too. Thanks for your attention, thanks for watching, and if you like this sort of thing, please subscribe.